technology.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for inviting us along today. Kind of what I'm going to say, I guess, follows on very directly from what we've heard already. If you just move the next one on, Ian, that'd be great. So what I want to try and quickly cover in my 10 minutes, some of which has been touched on already, but just have a little bit of a look at the impact of COVID-19 on people living on low incomes. It's one of the things that I think we've heard new news yesterday, and we've started to pick up over the last couple of weeks. The actual direct impact of COVID-19, which I think, as others have said, has that fact in itself kind of casts as a lens through which to look at the overall impact of COVID-19 on our society, and then look a little bit at the kind of immediate impacts, which, looking down the comments, a lot of you have already discussed and picked up on some of the things that the Poverty Alliance has been hearing from our members over the last 4 or 5 weeks, and then to kind of finish on maybe perhaps picking up some of what Jamie was saying. You know, this is an opportunity. We perhaps shouldn't call it an opportunity, but things are going to change, and as things start to change, we have a role, or we should have a role, in influencing what kind of change takes place. So I want to try and maybe set out where our thinking is at the moment in terms of the big areas that we want to focus on and change, and where we need to work together as civil society organisations to make that change happen. So maybe go on to the next slide, Ian. Great, thank you. So some quite unfortunately depressing statistics here on this first slide, looking at the very clear correlation and relationship that appears to be emerging around the impact of COVID-19 and poverty. So the figures that were released in Scotland yesterday showed that the death rate is more than double in the most deprived areas of Scotland compared to the least deprived areas, so the most deprived fifth. Now, that's a very clear and emerging picture. I think we also, at the same time, I would say, treat some figures, particularly at the local authority level, with some caution. So we see a clear correlation. So Inverclyde, for example, has, I think, the highest rate of deaths per 10,000 at 13 per 10,000. Glasgow is just over 8 per 10,000, but East Renfrewshire, not a local authority with high levels of deprivation, or as high as other local authority levels, I should say, also has a death rate of 8 per 10,000. So there are definite patterns starting to emerge, but I think given the nature of this virus and the way it impacts in local areas and the way it's spread, we just need to have some caution around some of those figures. But we do know that there's very clear impacts. We've already talked about food insecurity. Food Foundation released survey data a few weeks ago saying that around about 1/5 of families had experienced food insecurity as a result of the lockdown. Trussell Trust have seen an 80% increase in demand for emergency food aid at the food banks that are a part of their network. We know that particular groups are experiencing that food insecurity more than others. So lone parents, around about 1/3 of lone parents in that Food Foundation survey said that they'd experienced food insecurity, so that fear or the inability to feed themselves or their family. Parents with a disabled child, almost half were reporting food insecurity. We also know that, I think it was Tressa Burke from Glasgow Disability Alliance had talked about COVID-19 and the response and the lockdown supercharging pre-existing patterns of inequality, and I think we see that unfortunately most clearly in the emerging links between Black and ethnic minority people and deaths from COVID-19, with across the UK more than 3.5 times people from Black African descent more likely to have passed away, and 2.7 times more likely to pass away people with Pakistan descent. So I think there's reasons for that, but those patterns of inequality that we know exist in our society are being reflected in the way that COVID-19 is impacting. And that also illustrates some of the issues that we know are behind that. So it's issues to do with overcrowded housing. It's people who are low-paid workers who are more likely to use public transport or who are working in key worker roles. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's a differential impact in terms of COVID-19 on how people are actually being affected directly and unfortunately in terms of deaths. If we move on to the next slide now, Ian, thanks. Oh, maybe back one, I think. Yeah. So some of the things that people have been talking to us about, we've done a couple of surveys now of members who are largely community organisations and national organisations with a focus on tackling poverty. And not surprisingly, people are talking to us about the very rapid experience of an income crisis that people are experiencing, either because they've already been made unemployed or because of the furlough and seeing a drop already in their incomes in terms of their pay packet. And we see as a result of that, people having to look for other sources of income. So things like Scottish Welfare Fund, we know that in March, so the very start of this crisis, applications for to the Scottish Welfare Fund up by 60% even in that time. So we can expect the figures for April for those numbers to go up even more. We see concerns not only about the immediate income crisis, but also about what that means in terms of people's ability to pay utility bills. So a lot of concern over energy bills. Obviously concerns about rents. So housing associations that are members of the Poverty Alliance talking about a real spike in inquiries around rent payments. So we can only imagine that that's replicated across the private rented sector as well, and concerns about debt as well. So we know that the universal credit system has made a significant number of advance payments. So people already starting to get concerned about getting into further debt. But our members also talking to us about the mental health impacts of lockdown on people that they're working with, made worse again by that sense of insecurity that comes from not knowing if people will have jobs to go back to if they're in work already, but also again made worse by digital exclusion. So it's good to see Scottish Government have made efforts to try and address that, but I think the scale of the problem is probably beyond what is currently being carried out. And that overall sense of isolation. So again, the role of the third sector in responding to this crisis, beyond the immediate financial implications for people on low incomes in terms of just providing connection, has been incredibly important, I think, from our experience. But those local organisations are also struggling, so that struggle to pivot to new ways of working, whether that's in many cases delivering emergency food aids or delivering advice in topics and areas that perhaps they weren't expert in previously. And also just that for some organisations, for many organisations, that drop off in income, whether it's through charitable fundraising or through training income, those kind of things that many of us in the third sector rely on. And increasingly what I'm hearing is a real concern over the long-term future of their organisations. So things like resilience funding have been really important in keeping organisations going at the moment, but a real concern about what happens in 3-4 months' time and beyond that, about how viable some organisations are. So maybe go on to the next slide and I'll try and pick up the pace here. So the longer term impacts, again, we've already talked around some of these issues, but we know with almost certainty now, and the Chancellor said as much yesterday, that we will be going into a recession. And the scale of that recession is something that I think most of us will not have experienced. So the level of new claims for universal credit, the last figures that I saw was 1.4 million new claims. So we've never seen the kind of daily or monthly increases in unemployment claims as we've seen in the last 4 to 6 weeks. Some of the analysis by the Institute of Fiscal Studies and others, so David Bell at Stirling University, suggests that unemployment could go up to as high as 20%. And again, that's a UK-wide figure. So if we think about the impact of increased unemployment on a subnational level, so thinking about Glasgow, thinking about some of the areas that already struggle with higher levels of unemployment, in Clyde, Dundee and so on, we're looking at really quite significant impacts in terms of local labour markets. And we know that some parts of those local labour markets are going to be hit worse than others, and that the recovery is going to be very long term. So ones that I put up there, hospitality, retail, transport, those are all sectors that are going to be very hard hit. And that means that some groups of workers are going to be harder hit than others. So young workers, women, people who are already in low paid employment are at much greater risk of unemployment as a result of the recession that seems inevitably going to follow. And that's going to put a greater increase and strain on our social security system. So there's been a temporary increase in universal credit, which is really very welcome, but only for new claims. But we know that some of the Scottish benefits that were supposed to be coming on stream over the next 18 months have been delayed. So Scottish Child Payment is delayed, although it's still prioritised, and hopefully we'll start payments sooner rather than later. But the Child Disability Payment and the Adult Disability Payment, so the takeover from PIP, have been delayed, but we don't know how long for. So that's, again, really important that we don't lose sight of those important changes that are taking place in the social security system at the Scottish level, and that we press for those to be picked up again as soon as possible. I'm going to my final slide now. So building back better, this is the phrase that everyone is using, and quite rightly, this is what we need to be focused on. So Jamie, I think, really highlighted the real opportunity that's there, and it's not just in the fact that we can't go back to a system that wasn't working for so many people. It's the fact that we have this outpouring of empathy for lower paid workers, and this greater sense of compassion and community than we've had. And that's, I think, the opportunity that we need to build on. So some of the things that we've been talking about and around this notion of Build Back Better, and we've been working with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance on what this might mean. Now, I would recommend looking at their 10 principles for building back better, and it really does help to give us a bit of a roadmap of what we ought to expect. But some of the priorities for a well-being focused recovery would be things like looking at the improvements that have been made in social protection, so that increase to universal credit, the pause in conditionality that's come with universal credit recently, making those kind of changes permanent. So making the increase in Scottish Welfare Fund, where we've seen a doubling of the size of the welfare fund, making that kind of change permanent, because those things are going to be needed. And in Scotland, looking at our powers to top up benefits again, and looking at those powers creatively and using them as an opportunity. These aren't things that are so distant. These are things that we have the legislation for just now. We have the powers, and what we need is the ideas and the wherewithal to use them. I think we also need to look at the support that goes to business as we build back better. So what are the conditions that are placed on companies that are receiving support from government, whether at the Scottish level or the UK level? to ensure that they're the best that we want to build back. We've been talking to living wage employers in Scotland, and they're very clear that they want the kind of principles that they've been supporting in terms of fair work to be at the heart of whatever new economy comes out of our current situation. We need to be looking at taxation to pay for the changes, and we need to be, I think, looking at wealth taxes in a way that we have not done in this country for a very long time. We need to look at the way that jobs are designed. So there's been some very tentative approaches at controlling 0 hours contracts, for example. So looking at how do we actually bring about the changes that we need to force better work, not just in terms of pay, but in terms of practices at work, and supporting flexible forms of work and redistributing work in new ways, again, that we haven't looked at. So these are the kind of changes that can be encouraged both at the UK and Scottish level, but also crucially at the local authority level as well. So really looking at what does fair work mean and what can we do about it as organisations and as public sector organisations at the local level. And I think one of the things that we've been looking at a lot, and I'll finish on, is what a new back to work service will mean, because we are going into territory that we've not been into really probably since the 1980s and early 1990s, at looking at probably a real significant increase in long-term unemployment. What are the things that we need to do to ensure that people are supported back into work as the economy hopefully gradually recovers? So building on things like Job Start grants in Scotland, but massively expanding, and also ensuring that the support is there to help people back into work as the economy recovers. And I guess the final point I would finish with is that the kind of changes that many of us, I think, in this call would want to see are not things that are going to be handed to us on a plate. They're not going to be given just because we think they're needed. So they are going to be things that need to be argued for in forums like this, and in the economic recovery forums at the local and at the national level. We're going to have to argue for them, lobby for them, and ultimately campaign for them. So I think that would be my call to all of us in this call today, is to make sure that we're on the front foot in terms of campaigning, making sure our demands are heard by those who need to hear them. Thanks, Ian.